today we're discussing factors that affect soil characteristics. So we're going to go through a whole list of factors that affect them and how they affect them. And then we're also going to talk about how to describe soil in terms of what does the color of a soil mean? What does the texture of a soil mean? How can you tell the texture of different soils? Things like that. Okay? Beginning. So, the characteristics of a soil in a particular area depend on several factors. And the first one we're going to talk about is climate. So climate is like the overall general weather conditions of an area. Okay? And these affect it because things like rainfall, temperature, and changing seasons are going to have a big impact on how much weathering is happening. Okay? In terms of chemical weathering depends largely on water. So if water is frozen, chemical weathering can't happen as much. And if water stays frozen, then things like ice wedging can't happen, because in order for ice wedging to happen, water has to freeze and then thaw and then freeze and then thaw and then freeze and then thaw. Okay? Also, if it can never form ice, then obviously ice wedging can't happen there either. And then also, as we discovered, a lot of flowing water can be a form of weathering. So if the water isn't flowing, then that type of weathering can't happen. So temperature matters a lot. In fact, it matters so much that an increase in just 10 degrees Celsius can actually double the rate of chemical reactions that take place, which means that more chemical reactions can happen, which means you'll have more chemical weathering happening. And the more weathering that happens, the thicker and more developed of a soil you will have. So if you have to have weathered rock in order to make soil. So if you don't have a lot of weathering happening, you can't make a lot of soil. Even if you have all the other ingredients for soil, if no weathering is happening, you can't make a well-developed soil. So more weathering means thicker, better soils form. Next up, I missed a point. So this is why tropical areas have much deeper soil layers than Arctic areas. If you look at the difference between them, Arctic areas have very thin layers of soil because they're pretty much frozen year-round, which means not a lot of weathering happening. Whereas tropical areas have lots of different weathering happen, lots of chemical reactions, lots of flowing, moving water, lots of weathering happening there. Now we can talk about another factor, which is the parent material. Okay. Any type of earth material, so earth material that you find on the earth, can be changed into soil by weathering, but it is easier to do it for some than others. And what type of rocks and minerals are present in the parent material will influence what you find in the soil and also how easy it is to form the soil. So when we talk about parent material, we're talking about what was the type of rock that was weathered and broken down in order to make this soil. Because as I'm sure you know, even though all the surface of the earth is rock, it's not all the same type of rock. So that's going to affect soil formation. For example, if you have sandstone, when you weather sandstone, surprise, surprise, you get sand in your soil. Okay? So those particles tend to be more sandy. Whereas if you weather down shale is a very flaky type of rock that makes flaky, tiny, flat pieces, which is going to leave you with more clay content in your soil. In addition to this, the type of mineral that is weathered can also affect the pH of the soil. So if you weather down limestone, you're going to get a soil that's got a very neutral pH, so around that 7 pH. Whereas if you wear down granite, you're going to get soil that is slightly acidic, so below 7 on the pH scale. If a rock is easier to weather, then the soil that's formed from it will be thicker and more developed than the soil that's over a parent material that is not easy to weather. So limestone, relatively easy to weather, so it wears down easily, so you tend to get lots more thicker, more developed soils over top of it, as opposed to a much harder rock that would be much more difficult to weather. Another factor would be topography. When we talk about topography, we're talking about the lay of the land. Are there landforms? What's the slope like? Things like that. Okay, so how the land is shaped is going to affect the soil formed there. Okay? For example, if you have a really steep slope, water runs off of that easy, which means you do get a decent amount of weathering, but unfortunately, everything that's weathered is eroded off the side of the slope with the running water. So you wind up with very thin soils on steeper slopes. Areas that are higher in elevation can't support as many living things. And if you remember, you have to have some organic matter to mix into your soil to make it a good, fertile, well-developed soil. So if there's not a lot of things that can live there, you don't have a lot of organic matter to mix in, and so the soils there don't have a lot of nutrients and development in them either. Another factor is time. Developing soil, good soil, that's good for supporting plants and things like that, takes a lot of time. So, soil that has just begun to develop is always going to be underdeveloped when compared to soils that have been forming for millions of years. So if you have an area where a new soil is forming, you can't expect that soil to be thick and full of nutrients and life. It takes time. The next one we're going to talk about is life in... Did it skip over it? Where's my life in soil?
Looks like you don't want us to do that.
Well, it's an important one. We need to talk about it. All right. Here it is. Life in soil. Organisms play an important role in soil formation. Some organisms actually live in the soil, right? We're familiar with these things like earthworms and some kinds of insects, okay? Some animals even live in the ground and burrow and things. There's also bacteria and funguses that are in the soil, and they're actually actively breaking down organic matter and decomposing it so it can get mixed into the soil. So those animals play a very obvious role in soil formation, I would say. But, believe it or not, all organisms, whether they are alive or dead, contribute to soil formation by adding humus to the soil. Okay? Humus is partially decomposed organic material. This organic material can come from when an organism dies and bacteria break them down and add them back to the soil, or it can come from an organism's waste that they leave outside and then that gets decomposed and put back into the soil. So humus is just that, it's partially decomposed, actually most of the way through decomposition, and it is what makes soil dark in color. So if you've ever seen a soil that's dark brown or black, that soil probably had a lot of humus in it, a lot of organic material that's being decomposed. That organic material has a lot of those nutrients that other living things need and can then get from the soil. Now we're going to talk about soil characteristics, okay? Soil can have several different characteristics, such as color. Color can tell you a lot about the soil. If the soil is dark gray or black, then that means it contains high amounts of organic matter. If it's yellow, brownish, or even red, that means that it was formed when iron was combining with a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. So it's got some oxidized iron in it. And if it's light gray or white, it contains silicon dioxide or calcite or some different clay minerals. So just by looking at the color, you can tell a little bit about the composition of the soil. The next characteristic that we'll talk about is texture. Texture actually refers to the different sizes of particles that make up a soil. The percentage of each of these particles that's present in the soil will determine the texture of it. There are 3 different sizes of particles. The first is sand. This is the largest of the particles. They are irregularly shaped, so they don't necessarily pack together very well. Okay, so this is going to mean you have lots of large particles, means water moves through it pretty easily. Silt are medium-sized particles, so they're smaller than sand particles, but like sand particles, they are also irregularly shaped. And then the smallest of the particles are clay particles. These are small particles, and they're not irregularly shaped. They're usually flat, which means they pack closely together and don't allow water through them easily, which is why you will notice that areas that have a lot of clay in the soil do not drain well. They hold on to moisture. We're going to stop here today because we're going to run out of class time, so we will finish these tomorrow, which, lucky you, means you don't have homework today.